Welcome, everyone, to the 28th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change virtual side event. My name is Neda Samunpour. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Global Peace and Prosperity Forum, the organization hosting this event. Our theme today is Reframing Economics, Prosperity in a Changing World. We live in turbulent times, on the cusp of several crises in an era of tipping points and major transitions. The scientific evidence is now overwhelming. On current trends, the world is rapidly depleting stability and resilience of independent systems, our global commons. The global commons, our shared heritage, comprise key biophysical systems with 9 planetary boundaries. 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have now been transgressed, putting our shared health and prosperity at risk. 3 of the boundaries have been breached, include climate change, biodiversity loss, and freshwater change. We have entered a critical cycle in which the interaction of the water crisis, global warming, and the loss of biodiversity and natural capital exacerbate all 3. Wetland erosion and lost soil moisture risk are turning some of the planet's great carbon stores into new sources of greenhouse gas emissions with devastating consequences for the climate. Without urgent systemic collective attention on the links between climate change, freshwater use, and biodiversity loss, there can be no sustainable future because inaction in one area invariably ripples across the others. So how do we align our economy with environmental stewardship to operate safely within the boundaries of the planet's key cycles? What transformative model would enable humanity to flourish within planetary boundaries? What does prosperity look like in a changing world? Living sustainably is rooted in balance, justice, and equity. Health is about balance. It involves what Aristotle called a virtuous balance between deficiency and excess. Ultimately, the economy is our relationship with each other and with the living world. We must decide whether we want that relationship to be based on extraction and exploitation or balanced with reciprocity and care. I am indeed very honored and privileged to have with us today world leaders with immense knowledge and experience who can share with us their insights to these very pressing issues. We will begin with His Excellency, Dr. Danilo Turk. If I may now just give a quick background to Mr. Turk. His Excellency served as President of Slovenia from 2007 to 2012. He's currently President of Club de Madrid, an organization of over 100 democratic former presidents and prime ministers. Mr. Turk has a rich and varied career as an academic, as a diplomat, as a UN official. In the years 1984 to 1992, he wrote several UN reports on human rights. Between 1986 and 1992, he served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. In 1990 to 1991, he took part in the drafting of the Constitution of Slovenia, and from 1992 to 2000 served as the first Slovene permanent representative to the UN in New York, representing Slovenia on the UN Security Council in 1998 and 1999. In 2000, he was invited by Kofi Annan, then Secretary General, to serve as a UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs from 2000 to 2005. He was elected then as President of Slovenia in 2007 and served in this capacity until 2012. Between 2015 and 2016, he chaired the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace, which published the report A Matter of Survival in 2017. In 2016, he was one of the candidates for the post of the Secretary General of the UN. He was elected President of the Club of Madrid in 2019, and in 2022, he was named one of the 12 eminent individuals invited to be part of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism to make concrete suggestions for more effective multilateralism arrangements across a range of key global issues. Mr. Turk, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important meeting, and thank you for this extensive summary of my previous career. You reminded me of things that I have been doing over decades, and obviously some of them have to do with the theme of our discussion today. And I would like to select from among them the work that I have been doing in 1980s on economic, social, and cultural rights. You see, I'm mentioning this because nowadays we hear suggestions, including from the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development, that the world needs a new restructured eco-social contract, and that this will bring together and social and environmental priorities, as well as the concerns for future generations, for inclusion and justice. And these new contracts should be centered on principles of human rights, gender equality, peace, and solidarity. Now, I think that human rights and gender equality clearly must be in any discussion of an alternative to a system that we are living now, which is really a result of prevalence of neoliberal ideology and economic thought based on that ideology. And I'm saying this in light of an element of my previous work that you quoted, and that is economic, social, and cultural rights. You see, in 1980s, as the Cold War was coming to an end, it was hoped that the world would be able to articulate an approach to human rights which would be more comprehensive and better balanced, because the distinction between civil and political rights on one hand, and those with the rights to be taken seriously, and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other hand, has been there and has been actually crippling the international action for human rights. And it was believed that as the Cold War and the ideological divisions will come to an end, we'll have a better balance, and that will be better for the people. Well, what actually happened was a replacement of one ideology with a new one, the neoliberal one, and that led to another set of problems. I would like to remind ourselves that if one looks at the Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and yesterday was the 75th anniversary of the adoption of that historically important document, one would find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights such articles as Article 21, everyone has the right to social security and is entitled to realization of economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and free development. I'm taking a shorter part of that article. Everyone has the right to work. Everyone has the right to rest and leisure. Everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living, and so forth. So one finds in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights many aspects which are later developed in the whole body of economic, social, and cultural rights. And I believe that now the time has come to put that segment of human rights more into the center of discussion, because they are really important. They are fundamental for well-being of people. Of course, they would not be complete without civil and political rights. They will not be complete without gender equality. And all this has to form a new ideological base for reframing of the international economic system. All right, so that is the conceptual base. But what to do? That's the question which really has to be discussed with great intensity and a sense of priority. Here in Club de Madrid, we have been thinking about this as, former presidents and prime ministers. We have actually been among the first to propose a World Social Summit, a second social summit. Some of us remember the first one of 1995. We have been in that process as well. And we know how important that social summit was for an articulation of policies that have led to Millennium Development Goals and subsequently to Sustainable Development Goals. So we believe that the World Social Summit should have a sequel, and the 30th anniversary would be a good moment to do that. Secretary General Antonio Guterres has accepted the idea, and last September, which means 3 months ago, the the Global Summit for Sustainable Development Goals have emphasized that this Social Development Summit should take place in 2025. So it will take place. The question is whether it will have an appropriate impact. It has to have a conceptual clarity, but it also has to have specific proposals on how international economic cooperation has to change. And here, Club de Madrid also has done some work already, and we would like to continue together with our partners. In November this year, we organized our main policy discussion called Policy Dialogue, which was about precisely these questions. And there were 3 major areas of proposals that came out of that process. And I will conclude my remarks by briefly referring to these 3 areas. The first relates to the question of fiscal capacity of states and the need for a fairer tax system. Tax fairness is an important instrument for anything that should be done and everything that should be done for the purpose of better balanced, more forward-looking, and more socially sensitive development for the future. Tax fairness. Now, of course, we describe this issue of tax fairness in some detail, including mentioning such ideas as the raising of the minimum tax rate at large businesses to 25%. So that's one thing that is really quite practical. Question is whether it is realistic or not, but that's a question for subsequent discussion. We also call for an international agreement, a framework agreement within the United Nations on tax policy. Again, a fairly bold proposal, but not an entirely new one. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion about these issues in the past. Nothing of that was conclusive, but maybe between now and 2025, we can figure out an approach that would be capable of meeting demands of most countries and therefore leading to some kind of international understanding, perhaps in a framework agreement form or perhaps in some other form. The second proposal relates to aligning climate finance with the people-centered national and international development initiatives. Now, so far, climate finance has been somewhat separate, and there are very good reasons to take that as a separate and important aspect of international cooperation. Clearly, that we do not have any doubt about that. But for the future, one needs to link the 2 concerns much more closely. So, and that should also be seen at the level of finance, climate finance and social development finance. And here also we have some proposals, and this was one of the reasons why we met in Brazil, because Brazil actually is a country that has given much thought to these issues and will hold important meetings next year as G20 president and also as the host of various climate-related meetings. And then finally, the third set of proposals relate to prioritizing strong and well-governed institutions that can effectively integrate and mainstream shared inclusive societies into economic, social, environmental, and technological commitments. Now, this too is important, but as we know, international institutions nowadays are under severe stress, so one has to understand the difficulty involved here. To conclude, I would like to say, in Club de Madrid, given the fact that we are all people with relatively long experience in these international discussions, and that we have gone through various situations in which some of the ideas were implemented, most were not, we know how important it is to come with bold ideas at the right time. We have tried to do our part. We have proposed the Second World Social Summit. We are developing ideas of what should go into it. And we are doing so on the basis of historic experience and current needs. You have referred to the inflection point at which the world finds itself. If that is the case, then of course we have to think about what a new world should look like. And with some luck, we may perhaps even get one. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a fantastic start to this program. If I may now turn to Ms. Espinosa, Her Excellency, Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garce was the president of the 73rd session of the General Assembly. She has more than 20 years of multilateral experience in international negotiations, peace, security, defense, disarmament, human rights, indigenous peoples, gender equality, sustainable development, environment, biodiversity, climate change, and multilateral cooperation. She has served as Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs twice, Minister of National Defense, and Coordinating Minister of Natural and Cultural Heritage. Ms. Espinosa was chair of the Group of 77 in China until January 2018 and also served as chair of the Andean Community. At the 56th session of the Commission of the Status of Women, she promoted the adoption of the resolution presented by Ecuador entitled Indigenous Women, Key Actors in Poverty and Hunger Eradication. She was a chief negotiator at the 16th and 17th conferences of the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and at the Rio +20 United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. In 2008, she was the first woman to become permanent representative of Ecuador to the United Nations in New York. She chaired the work of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States in Geneva and at the 21st Conference of the Parties on Climate Change in Paris. Ms. Espinosa was special advisor to the president of the Constituent Assembly that drafted the Constitution of Ecuador in 2008 and regional director and advisor on biodiversity at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I must add that she's also one of the 4 women that has had this post as president of the General Assembly. Ms. Espinosa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Neda, for this invitation. And believe me, you have good research because you mentioned things of my CV that I have totally forgotten about in a very, very kind and generous presentation. So thank you, and thank you for having us. Thank you to the Global Peace and Prosperity Forum. Of course, we are here to discuss such a critical issue. We are experiencing, as Danilo mentioned, a planetary crisis, and the planetary crisis calls for rethinking the overall development pathways, rethinking our lifestyles, our consumption and production patterns. In short, basically, we are called to rethink the way human societies relate to nature. And I think so the title of this conversation cannot be more important and more timely: reframing economics. Excuse me. First of all, thank you and greetings to all my co-panelists as well, and greetings from Doha, where I am currently. So I think it's good that we meet now. We are just in the midst of a true diplomatic battle in Dubai over the final outcome of the climate COP28. And if you allow me, I would like to use the case of climate as a microcosm of what needs to change to ensure that our economies are geared towards human well-being, at the same time that, of course, they respect the integrity and regeneration capacity of our ecosystems. I think that's the critical question of our times. Together, of course, with this need for a new social contract among humans. I think that we need to renew this global social contract. And why am I suggesting to pick climate? Because I think climate is a microcosm of this disconnect, of this I would say fracture between society, the economy, and politics at the end of the day. If you look at every single report the science. The latest UNEP emissions gap report is telling us out loud that this has been a year of broken records, with record-breaking temperatures exceeding the 1.5 degrees and increasing steadily greenhouse gas emissions. As scientists tell us, we have trespassed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, which means that this transgression is leading to catastrophic impacts, particularly for the most vulnerable communities, for the coastal communities. And this is deepening global inequalities and really exacerbating poverty and hunger. The same goes for the IPCC latest report. It clearly warned us of an acceleration of these trends of increasing emissions, widening inequalities, increasing poverty. It is really a vicious circle. And we are getting closer to breaching this 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature threshold that we set in the Paris Agreement. So it is very important that we know, and this is very connected to the economic models, but the global carbon budget is extremely limited, and the window to stabilize temperature is rapidly closing. I really hope that the negotiators right now in Dubai, they remember, that very fact. So to limit global warming and accelerating adaptation and resilience really requires something like, if I'm not mistaken, a drastic reduction of 22 gigatons of CO2 before 2030. That's what the science is telling us. And the recent Paris Plus 10 report, is telling us that reducing emissions is insufficient. We need to actively even remove emissions that we already have produced in the past. So we see, why is this the defining issue of our times? In climate teamed with a water crisis, with the extinction crisis, with the pollution crisis. Why is it so important? Because, for example, the V20 countries that are now, I think the list of V20, they started with 20 countries, but now I think that there are 58 extremely vulnerable countries. They have lost around $600 billion in the past 20 years just because of climate-induced disasters. This loss is about 1/5 of their collective wealth. And this, of course, highlights the disproportionate impact of climate change in the most vulnerable countries and populations within these countries. There is increasingly here, I was just speaking about that today at the Doha Forum, there is an interdependence between conflict and climate change. This also has implications in our macroeconomic designs, in the way we value nature. Fragile states and conflict-affected areas receive significantly less climate finance, up to 80 times less than non-fragile states. And this was very clear and stated a few days ago in the Declaration of Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace that was subscribed during this COP28 COP. So the window of opportunity is closing. We are racing against the time. And it's not that we're talking about action for the next decade. We are talking about the next 6 or 7 years to enact meaningful transformation in the way we deal with the climate crisis. So this period is not only critical, but I would say it's decisive. As mentioned, the scientific consensus is clear. We must transition from rhetoric to action immediately to avert the severe consequences of climate change. And as we also know, the struggle now is about phasing out fossil fuels the energy sector remains the primary contributor to air pollution, into emissions. Basically, when we look at the pollution front, we see that air pollution affects over 90% of the global population, and it's linked to 6 million premature deaths annually. We both Arunava and I serve at the Clean Air Commission on Clean Air, our Clean Air it's called. And this is also another critical environmental catastrophe. This teamed with the need to clean cooking solutions right now. And it's not that I'm bringing bits and pieces here, but what I want to prove here is that basically, our model of production, our energy matrix is really not aligned with not only the Paris Agreement targets, but also with the Sustainable Development Goals, with the well-being of people worldwide. And basically, we need a complete, a dramatic change of the way we produce and consume, as I mentioned. And I have witnessed myself over a decade of commitments to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, for example, $7 trillion a year. And but the reality is starkly different. There is a significant discrepancy between the government rhetoric and the actual implementation. So in 2022 alone, governments allocated an unprecedented, as I mentioned, $7 trillion annually to these subsidies. And currently, there is evidence that some governments have plans to produce more than 100% more fossil fuels by 2030 than what is compatible to the 1.5 degree target. And it's not that 1.5 degree is a goal to achieve. It is a hard stop, for us to prevent an overall world climatic catastrophe. So the question here is that we have the technologies. Renewable energies have never been so cheap and so accessible. We have the knowledge. We know clearly what science is telling us. And there is a disconnect in applying our knowledge in the resources we have and the science we have and the technologies to resolve this planetary emergency, this what I call a systemic civilizational crisis. And that needs a radical transformation on, as Danilo mentioned, on our societal, economic, political relationship with nature. It is not just about political will and leadership, as we often hear. It is about fundamentally rethinking our lifestyles, our consumption patterns, our cultural values to align with planetary boundaries. Basically, I would like perhaps to close with some ideas of what are the issues that perhaps we need to change dramatically to think about a new economics of the Earth system. So first of all, as I mentioned before, Neda and co-panelists, we need a fundamental shift in our perception of nature, in our definition of nature. So nature is not a repository of unlimited resources that can be used and deployed as externalities of our economic activity. No, in the Ecuadorian constitution, nature is a rights holder in its own right. It's integral to our existence. It's our supporting web of life in a way. It is a complex system, the Earth system that us humans have to cherish, protect, and ensure that it remains healthy, it exists and regenerates. That's what exactly the Constitution of Ecuador says. So the Earth system is our most important commons. And that, of course, includes the idea of considering the atmosphere in a stable climate as part of our commons. So we need even a legal recognition of a stable climate as a common good of humanity. And that requires, of course, innovative policy and financial tools to look at climate in this different way. You know, the climate as part of the Earth system. The second issue, I think, is the need for a paradigm shift, the need of a new economic model that internalizes the value of nature as central to human security and well-being. So we need to transition to a model that emphasizes what we call now climate justice, which means categories that truly value ecosystem services and adopt a basic principle in environmental policy and practice and science, which is the precautionary principle, the do no harm principle, a model that values, collective action, fair resource distribution, and moving beyond this idea of the polluter pays, and if we put a price on carbon, we will solve everything. It helps, of course, but it's not the full solution. We need to value adequately ecosystem services, which is central to this new harmony that needs to be established between society's economy and nature. And we need to reassess economic systems to recognize the intrinsic value of a stable climate of biodiverse ecosystems. And I think that the same happens, as I said, not only with the atmosphere, but with the water cycle, etc., with the biodiversity and genetic resources pool. And number three, I think that we need to acknowledge, and it has been widely acknowledged now, but we don't act upon it, that we need to understand that the current international financial system, as we know it, is outdated and very unfair. So it is crucial to establish a more inclusive, efficient, for example, global tax system, inclusive, efficient debt restructuring process. I won't go into the detail on what debt is doing, as one of the main obstacles to improve investment in low carbon and climate friendly development models in highly indebted developing countries. So when you tell me, what needs to change, for example, the multilateral banks need to change the way they do business, the terms and conditions for their loans, the very definition of risk, the debt assessment systems that they have put in place, and bring in climate vulnerabilities, environmental vulnerabilities of countries. We are working, and there's an initiative on a very concrete debt relief mechanisms for climate investment, basically on adaptation and resilience building. And basically what we see is that we need a full-fledged rethinking, redesign of the analytical tools, of the policy tools, of the epistemological and definitional tools on how to better govern the Earth system through principles of cooperation, shared responsibility, common interest, intergenerational responsibility. So at the end of the day, what we need is a new Earth system economics that go beyond the idea of illimited growth and that decouple GDP, with the overall well-being of humans and the integrity of our planet. There are initiatives already starting at the UN called the Beyond GDP initiative, and to decouple, the idea that well-being of people is about illimited growth and based on values of greed, but on the contrary, there is a need, a crying need to make peace with nature and to design the economic instruments to really, build and shape a new economics of the Earth system. And I'm sure that Arunava, he's an expert on that, is going to bring us a little more clarity on all of this. And my final call to the ones listening right now is, please do put pressure on our negotiators in Dubai right now to make sure that the outcomes of COP28 are going to be, as bold as they need to be, because we are reaching a tipping point, a point of no return in our capacity to face the climate crisis that we are facing. So we should act now. It's not an issue of the future. The future starts today, and our lives and survival are in risk if our politicians and leaders do not take the right decision. So thank you, and over to you, Neda.
Thank you very much for another very wonderful, comprehensive beginning, which again puts the whole perspective of our discussions into focus. Our next speaker is Dr. Arunava Ghosh. He is an internationally recognized public policy expert, author, columnist, and institution builder. He is the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, and has led CEEW to the top ranks as one of Asia's leading policy research institutions and among the world's 20 best climate think tanks. He played a formative role in creating the International Solar Alliance and was a founding board member of the Clean Energy Access Network. He's co-authored editor of 4 books, and with experience in 48 countries, he previously worked at Princeton, Oxford, UNDP, and WTO in Geneva. The Asia Society has honored him recently with 2022 Asia Game Changer Award for his incredible work, which is making a real difference for India and for the planet. Dr. Ghosh advises governments, industry, civil society, international organizations around the world. He currently serves on government of India's G20 Finance Track Advisory Group and advises the Sherpa Track for India's G20 presidency in 2022 to 2023. In 2022, the UN Secretary General appointed him to the high-level expert group on the credibility and accountability of net zero announcements by non-state actors. Dr. Ghosh is currently vice chair of the UN Committee for Development Policy, having been first nominated to the UN CDP by the UN Secretary General in 2018. He's a member of several international experts advisory groups, Global Commission on the Economics of Water, high-level group of economics constituted by the French president for the One Planet Lab, and the high-level consultative group for the US Department of State's Energy Transition Accelerator. In 2020, the government of India appointed him co-chair of the Energy, Environment and Climate Change Track for India's Science, Technology and Innovation Policy. He has been appointed the co-chair of the T20 Task Force on Climate and Energy for G20 presidencies led by Indonesia in 2022 and India in 2023. Dr. Ghosh, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Neda, and thank you to the forum for inviting me. It is a little embarrassing to have my CV read out in the presence of 2 excellencies, Mr. Turk and Ms. Espinosa, but I will accept this with great pleasure and much honor. So thank you so much for allowing me to share the stage with them. There is very little to add with regards to what my previous speakers have said. So what I will do is, be a little bit more provocative in terms of how do we take the ideas that they've put forward, sort of the human-centric, human rights focus on one hand, as well as bringing nature fundamentally into the heart of our conversation around new economics. Now, how do we operationalize this? That's really what I want to submit to everyone on the panel and, of course, to your audience, and then look forward to the conversation that will follow. And I think we can operationalize it in 3 different ways. The first way is to move from flows to stocks. The second is to move from liabilities to assets. And the third is to move from production to consumption. Now, each of these 6 things I've listed are actually standard economic phrases with their respective meanings and definitions. But we've got to nudge this new economy or new economics towards a new and sustainable economy in a different way. So let me just illustrate this with some examples. Let's start with flows versus stocks. And I'll give 2 examples. One, Maria Fernanda Espinosa has already highlighted from the point of view of the climate crisis. What matters is not just the flow of emissions, but the stock of emissions that are getting accumulated in the atmosphere. Now, a lot of what we do with regards to economic accounting is actually look at only the flows. So we measure a single year's GDP or a single year's value addition based on how much flow of inputs, intermediate products, and final products and services happen. And at each stage, we add some value. And as long as we are constantly adding value at each stage, each individual economic agent is doing their so-called rational thing. But what is happening as a result of this flow is that the stock of carbon and the stock of greenhouse gases continues to accumulate in the atmosphere. And that is what is causing the problem we are faced with, right? So as long as we maintain an economics which is hinged on measuring progress purely on the basis of flow of inputs to outputs and value addition in the interim, we will keep actually compounding, not just adding, we'll keep compounding the stock problem that we have with regards to carbon and the resulting climate crisis. Now, let me give another example. And this is again where Maria Fernanda and I serve on something called the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, where the problem is actually the reverse, where our focus is, again, so much on measuring the flow and the sort of value we derive from it that we forget to value the stock of water that is there. So again, we need a switch in how we're thinking about it. So we, first of all, are underpricing water. Secondly, wherever we are pricing it, we are undervaluing water. So water has a role in the ecosystem. There's biodiversity functions that water plays. Water has a role in what is called blue water, the water that we see in our lakes and rivers. Water has a role in green water, what's in the soil and the plants, and then through evapotranspiration, through atmospheric rivers, and how that is then impacting the water cycle in other geographies. So what happens in the Amazon has an impact thousands of kilometers away in other geographies in terms of precipitation available or not. Now, in all of this, unless we are valuing the stock of water and the way that is replenished and restored and protected matters in terms of the short-term versus long-term value that we get from the flow of water, pun intended. So what we need then is, in order to have a more sustainable approach towards the water crisis that the world is facing, in addition to the climate crisis that the world is facing, we're going to start with valuing that stock of water. And from that value, we have to derive a price. And then that price has to be further passed on to the final consumer with the attendant social protections, especially for the vulnerable. Right now, it is the other way around. The vulnerable are paying a higher price than the privileged, and the privileged are underpricing the water, and the price itself is undervaluing the stock that we have. This is one kind of fundamental shift we need in our economics. The second kind of shift that we need is, as I said, between liabilities and assets. Now, when we often think of environmental crises, we are rightly so presenting them as the costs that are being imposed, whether it is loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, loss of ecosystems, and so on and so forth. Now, there is value to doing that, but there is also value to doing the converse. What is the asset role that a preserved ecosystem or preserved commons presents to our economies? And let me now take the example of air pollution versus clean air. Again, Maria Fernanda and I serve on another commission called Our Common Air, which you referred to. Now, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for? We know that air pollution across the world, depending on the estimates, is resulting in loss of lives of up to 6, 7, 8 million people on an annual basis. We know that this is having an impact on massive public health burdens that developing countries and other places are having to endure as a result of one of the largest public health crises that we are faced with. But is there a better way, or is there something more that we can do by framing not air pollution just as a liability, but clean air as an asset? And in doing so, then, we look at not just the avoided mortality and morbidity issues with relation to public health, but we also look at other things. For instance, better educational attainments when children are going to school in areas with cleaner air. The benefits towards investment, where we find that corporate investment tends to move then more towards areas where the air pollution indices are lower, where new technologies, including for pollution abatement and otherwise, or clean energy or clean mobility, then creates new economic opportunities, new sectoral drivers of growth that then spurs the economic growth measured narrowly, where, for instance, the productivity from our solar panels improves. So on one hand, we're investing in renewable energy to fight the climate crisis. On the other hand, the productivity or the efficiency of the solar panels is denuded because of air pollution. They clean up the air, that improves. Improvement in tourism potential and driving the services economy. These are just some examples of how framing the same issue from an asset perspective then allows economic policymakers, not just environmental policymakers or public health policymakers, but economic policymakers to start thinking of an environmental good, a protected common, as a driver of the economic growth they're pursuing, rather than a cost or a liability that is dragging away or dragging them down in the pursuit of the wealth creation. The final example I want to give is with regards to production versus consumption. Now, of course, again, GDP is measured in many different ways. You could measure GDP in terms of production. You could measure GDP in terms of consumption, how much income is spent by the household, by the government, by corporations, or through net exports. But what is missing in all of this is the implication of our individual footprints. Last year, for instance, in India, my home country, something called Mission Life was launched, Lifestyle for Environment. And it's not just a feel-good, touchy-feely, let's switch off the lights and fans approach. What we see is that there is an economic paradigm where sustainable consumption, sustainable government procurement, sustainable corporate investment, sustainable net exports actually has a GDP impact, a positive GDP impact, while lowering down the footprints. So you move, for instance, dietary preferences, you move towards more sustainable crops. Mobility preference, you go from private transport to public transport. Energy preferences, materials preferences. All of this then makes sure that sustainable consumption becomes a driver not just of GDP, but also a way to keep lowering one's footprint. And the IEA estimates that a series of sustainable consumption choices could actually remove about 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from our emissions equation. So this is a non-trivial pillar of climate action, which we seem to be ignoring. But it's not just about climate action. It's not just about putting solar panels on our roof. If we are not ensuring that the materials that are going into the solar panels, the minerals that are going into the batteries, are also being treated in a manner that has a sustainable footprint. Again, Maria Fernanda referred to this issue from a different perspective, the protection of biodiversity. So it's not enough to solve for just the climate crisis if we are ignoring the other convention that was also inked in 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Or the third convention, which was linked to land degradation. So all of this is actually linked. And we cannot just have a carbon cycle story and just look at the emissions abatement of carbon without looking at the materials footprint that we have. And that means we need to have a completely different economic paradigm focused on circularity rather than linearity. So really what I'm submitting to you is that, yes, we need a human-centric approach. Yes, we need to integrate with nature much more in our economic paradigms. But the way to do it is to take the readily available economic concepts, but then turn them around in terms of whether you look at flows or you look at stock, whether you look at assets or you look at liabilities, whether you look at production or you look at sustainable consumption. And once we start educating ourselves and our kids, I think we will begin to see that a lot of the market failures that emanate from economics, because our assumptions assume away those market failures, actually can get corrected by the very tools that we've been given through the discipline.
Thank you very much. Thank you for an excellent start as well. If I may now, we'll do our round of questions, and maybe I'll ask each one separately. And if anybody else wants to join in and say something on their, please go ahead. Maybe if I may start with Mr. Turk. Is it possible to democratize the energy sector as we transition from fossil fuel dependency to renewable energy? I mean, can we develop a pathway that avoids risks associated with excessive extractive practices that have been out of sync with a world of tipping points and potentially catastrophic and irreversible change? I mean, one of the things that renewable energy gives is the ability to develop energy within your own community nations. You're not so dependent on petrostates or fossil fuel companies, so that each country can basically control the energy, develop it as they want, whether it's wind, solar, hydrogen, whatever it is. So doesn't that make sense to actually push for renewable energy, not just for this for the environment, but also for the economics of a nation state? You're not, yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if the idea of democratizing is the right one or the most helpful one. I think that here, I think it is preferable to remain within the context of sustainability and cost. These are the kind of economic ideas or economic concepts which have to be developed further. And as I was listening to Dr. Arunava Ghosh speaking about the sustainable consumption, it appears to me that there is a great deal of work to be done in this context in a purely economic sense. You see, when the idea of sustainable development started to circulate following the Brundtland Commission study, it was initially a nice terminological innovation. And the basic hypothesis of that report were really that there should be no contradiction between ecology and economy, and therefore sustainability is the trick. Now, but going from the situation of a trick or a terminological innovation to a coherent theoretical and policy framework, that's a long way. And it goes through different stages. It deals with different issues. It deals with technological innovation. It has to deal with questions of economic, but also the question of public consciousness. You see, let us take the example of wind turbines and using wind power more generally. One can say, well, you know, there was a time when this was not seen as sufficiently relevant. You know, it's not sufficient amount of energy that can be created, or it's not sufficiently sustainable in the sense that wind power is not really steady, but, you know, has different phases or different gaps. And therefore, it was difficult to figure out the pricing and the economic effect of wind power. No, but then, of course, technology started to be more affordable. The experience has shown how to use the wind power, and the whole practice progressed. And then comes a really very interesting aspect, which I have seen in various countries, including in my own country, in Slovenia, where people are extremely careful and extremely cautious, perhaps overcautious, against using of wind power on the basis that wind power, actually wind turbines and their work somehow harm biodiversity locally. And then, of course, it's very easy to organize democratically, I emphasize, local opposition to something that is, you know, carbon-free energy and would economically make perfect sense. So what I'm trying to say is there is a process, and before we get to a solution which takes care of all aspects, we have to do a lot of learning. We have to go through experience. We have to obtain experience, and we have to come to solutions which answer all these different questions. I have recently been to, earlier this year, been to a Chinese town of Wenzhou, which is a port city, and where the local authorities had a big debate about wind turbines. It's a geographically convenient place, because it's surrounded by mountains, so there is a lot of wind going from the mountains towards the sea. And on land, on the slopes, it would be quite easy to establish wind turbines with steady flow of air, with technology which is affordable. So economically, one can work out things without hesitation and say, all right, we have all the calculations and everything would make sense, and there will be a significant impact. But you know, there was a question, which was not a question of democratic decision making, but really appropriate understanding of sustainability. Both technical and political people came to the conclusion that wind turbines do have an impact on biodiversity, and that this has to be taken into account, that it must not be neglected given the complete adequacy of the rest of calculations, the technology, cost, effect, and all that. And they came to a conclusion, all right, we are not going to locate those turbines on land, but rather on sea. On the sea, there is a little less wind coming to that point, but there is also less effect on biodiversity. So a calculation of the balance between biodiversity and the actual energy effect was done anew, because in the meantime, the understanding of the importance of biodiversity has grown. I don't think that this has as much to do with democracy per se, as it does with the sophisticated understanding of the problems involved. In Slovenia, we are not that good in calculations. We are much behind. We are much more robust in democratic opposition to anything. That's a kind of tradition. But what I'm trying to say is understanding and better, full development of the concept of sustainability is necessary. It relates to consumption, but it relates to other aspects as well. And just to conclude with a historic example. Some years ago, I was in Dublin and we were visiting the famous brewery, the Guinness Brewery. And the question then was, well, how did that brewery come about? What was the trick? And the answer was, well, the owner has obtained a license to use local water resource cost-free. And of course, he had plenty of water. It was adequate quality. It didn't cost anything, and that created a profitable business. Now, what Maria Fernandez Espinosa and Dr. Ghosh were telling us is, well, it should never be that simple. Things have to be valued. Things have to be valued. They didn't have to be valued, 100, 200 years ago, but now they have to be. And to conclude, obviously, we need to develop this concept of sustainability much further. It has to be developed in great detail. It has to be developed with all these aspects which I mentioned in these examples. It has a democratic dimension also. But let us not rely on that. Let us then make a complete calculation and then see how it fits in a political framework which may be democratic or perhaps less democratic.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If I may ask, maybe Maria, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the text has come out from COPS. I don't know, the news is saying that it's not including phasing out of fossil fuels, but states that rapidly phasing down unabated coal and limitations on new and unabated coal power generations, and also mentions reducing both consumption and production of fossil fuels. So given the concern we've all now, everyone's been sharing about what the scientists are saying about the shrinking carbon budgets and the overwhelming uncertainty and scalability of carbon dioxide removal technology, can we risk actually, the 1.5 that we need to get to keep within and reach net zero on carbon dioxide with this technology to offset fossil fuel emissions without actually knowing that it really works at scale?
Well, tonight around 9 p.m. there is a plenary to discuss the latest texts, and I don't know what is going to happen at the end, but it is a real pity that the language on phasing out couldn't make it. I still have a small hope. And why is it? There is a big difference to say, our promise is to align to the 1.5 limit that we agreed on Paris. And in order to reach that goal, we need to phase out fossil fuels. And of course, the responsibility differs from country to country, the pathways, how to get there. But at least to have the commitment is what we wanted out there. So the issue of unabated coal, the issue of unabated oil, in the new technologies to decrease carbon from the production of fossil fuels, all of that, we know it's not enough. We know, and it's not me saying it, it's science saying that all of this is not enough. We need to make sure that 22 gigatons are not produced of CO2 are not produced until 2030. And, it's an arithmetic thing. And the problem is that it's not that we don't know and that people don't understand the difference between, a phasing down and speaking about unabated fossil fuels. I mean, we know, everybody knows what it means. And the issue is when basically we think about the next elections, and we think about a national myopic so-called national interest. The cost of inaction in the climate front is huge in all fronts, not only in economic terms. We know that in 48 hours, the entire infrastructure of a small island developing state disappears. 80% of the GDP of St. Vincent and the Grenadines was lost, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, with a huge hurricane, wiped out almost the entire island. So the economic cost is high. The human cost is high. The nature cost is high because of inaction. But then the issue of greed, the issue of power, the issue of thinking that it's my national interest. The most conservative numbers say that by 2050, if we continue with the trend of steadily increasing emissions, we are going to see close to 2 billion people displaced by 2050. Where are all these people going to go? There is a strong relationship between conflict and climate. If you look at the 14 most vulnerable, climate vulnerable countries, 8 of them have a peacekeeping operation or a political special mission under their borders. Increasingly, we're understanding that armed conflict is connected to the climate crisis. So it really doesn't make sense. It's a paradox. It doesn't make sense. More displacement, more conflict, increase in food food insecurity and hunger, increase of poverty, and yet we are not able to take the bold decisions that are needed. And what is really worries me is that the multilateral system is proving to be ineffective, because if you ask the negotiators right now in Dubai, I am sure that 98% of the countries favor the idea of the phasing out. And of course, then each country has to do its own roadmap on how to get there. I mean, that's a different issue. If we're talking about a just transition, a just and inclusive transition, but we need to have that kind of standard for everybody. So at some point, the idea of thinking that consensus is unanimity, perhaps we need to rethink that. Unfortunately, there are very powerful countries that oppose are in disagreement with the decisions that need to be made. The arithmetics of NTCs do not match. Now the decision of speaking about all these very complicated language instead of phasing out fossil fuels is going to put us really in a bad situation. This year of 2023 has been the hottest year in record already. Let's imagine if we continue to do that, 1.2% increase in emissions only in 2022. So it doesn't make sense. Believe me, if a person from a different planet would land here and see what we do as humans, they would think that we are completely mad, because we are destroying the very foundation of our existence as a species. So it's hard to explain to an extraterrestrial person. It's hard to explain. And this comes again to valuing ecological services and valuing nature in a different way. Not always a crematistic way. Not only putting a price tag on everything is going to solve the planetary crisis we are facing. So we recently launched last week the report on the Climate Governance Commission. And one of the issues that we are calling for is a formal declaration of the UN of a planetary emergency, and the need to speed up action, and the need to have better accountability and liability mechanisms in the multilateral space. And we are calling for a reform to COPs, because we know now that COPs have become this huge space for everything except for the things that really matter. You know, I'm all for inclusive COPs, people coming, 104,000 people disembarked in Dubai, these past days. And it's good to see, young voices, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, the private sector, etc., being worried, scared, and concerned about the climate crisis. Is always good, but sometimes we lose sight of what is really important, is the very core multilateral agreements, the very part of the negotiation that now is about to collapse, I would say. I really hope for the best, of course. I really hope for the best, but it's hard to explain. And for if you have children, if you think about the younger generations, how is that we're going to explain that we are unable to preserve our own life supporting systems? So we have the economic tools, we have the technologies, we even have the resources, and yet we are unable to do what we need to do. So we need to better match, politics and science, and in a sense of responsibility, and that of course goes beyond the idea and the need for a new economic thinking and for a new economic paradigm. But and perhaps I'm very anxious because of what is happening. My phone is exploding of WhatsApps and mails and people saying do something. And the truth is that I wish, but sometimes we feel also helpless. Just a call. Please use your social media and say, please, let's be serious, let's be responsible. And sorry I spoke so much, but I'm really worried on what is going to happen.
Thank you. I think that's a reflection how everyone's feeling at the moment, especially with this COPs. Picking up on what everyone has been talking about, especially about the economics and GDP and how it can be changed. But there was a discussion in the European Parliament about a couple of months ago, and they were discussing about alternatives to GDP. I know the Secretary General has recommended complementary measures to GDP, but they were discussing beyond growth as a model. They were saying that when governments pursue growth as a goal in itself, that they undertake desperate and damaging measures to make it happen. Even a fraction now, we know, of a degree of warming will make life harder for people and ecosystems. And we can see why it's so difficult for petrostates and fossil fuel firms to agree to it, to a wording for phasing out, because last year, according to figures, they made 4 trillion in profits out of with the invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis that developed. The energy prices skyrocketed. So when they're faced with this option of, we can make so much money in the short term, let's just carry on a little bit, that will then feed into the welfare of our countries, welfare of our communities. We could just postpone it a little bit longer, then phase out into or phase down and try and see whether technology can help us. So a lot of it is this growth dependency. They're saying it's because everything we do has to relate to economic growth. We need this 3% growth or 2% growth every year. So if that was taken out the model of the economic framework, can that even be taken out of the model? And would that change the way we structure our economy to a more well-being economy? Is that possible? If I could address that to Dr. Ghosh.
I think there's one debate about, whether there is growth and beyond growth. And there's another debate about growth for who. And I think again, in addressing a planetary crisis, while the Paris Agreement ensured, and rightly so, ensured that everybody has a stake in trying to solve this crisis, there's a danger of having enveloped everyone in the same kind of, with the same brush, which is why I drew attention to production versus consumption. Just last week during COP, my organization brought out a report which showed that the richest 10% in developing countries have a lower carbon footprint than the average person, average citizen of a developed country. So the point is, yes, we are faced, I completely agree with Maria Fernanda, we are both on this Climate Governance Commission. We are faced with not one, but multiple planetary crises. But there is, the other crisis we are faced with is a complete lack of empathy of, the vulnerable. And vulnerability is an environmental vulnerability, or an vulnerability to environmental shocks. But there's also vulnerability to inequality. And we've not used in, I think, 1 hour, 20 minutes of this conversation, I'm not sure, inadvertently or otherwise, I don't think the word inequality came up in any one of our presentations or in the discussion. And not because we don't care about it, but the economic system is structured in a way that it reinforces inequality, and then we paper over it by saying, let's all solve this together. So in trying to solve for instance, the political economy in the United States for decades of inaction on climate change, you rightly got a huge federal legislation in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act. But what it does is it reinforces inequality, because it takes away investment from developing countries and invests it back for the purposes of growth in new clean sectors, whether it's green hydrogen or solar panel manufacturing. You dig up minerals from the DR Congo or from Bolivia, and you send it somewhere else for processing, which drives economic growth. We're solving the climate crisis, but it's widening the technology gap. Just 5 G20 countries, not even all of the just 5 G20 countries have over 85% of the clean tech patents. So my question is not about whether we can think about a beyond GDP paradigm, but can we truly think about it when the world we are living in is structured on the basis of power, politics, and which is driving this inequality? So this, what is needed is some kind of a balance between competitive economic models and collaborative and cooperative economic models. Both are needed, not because one sounds fluffier and nicer. Sometimes you got to collaborate and coordinate to solve for something, a common crisis coming and hitting us. And sometimes you have to compete in order to promote innovation. But we are swinging from one to the other without realizing the consequences. And by papering over these inequalities, by papering over the structural deficiencies that we have in our economic system, we are imposing the burden disproportionately on those who haven't created the problem, who continue to not have it. So why does, for instance, India, which has the 4th largest renewable energy market in the world, get less than 3% of global renewable energy investment? Why does all of Africa get less clean energy investment than India itself? Right? So if the sun is shining the most between the tropics, then there's a real problem why money is not flowing where the sun is shining the most. So it is actually not about pursuit of growth or otherwise. It is that it suits us to maintain this inequality while, enveloping us in a cloak of planetary, preservation, because it does not ask us to change our own lifestyles enough. No one asks. We celebrate the production of an electric car and a battery that can go 500 miles and an electric truck that can drive. We never ask, why does an urban dweller need an electric SUV? We just celebrate the fact that the SUV has gone from petrol to electric. We never ask, why does that person need the SUV in the first place? And this is that I can carry on my lifestyle without any compromise. And then we are all going to sing Kumbaya by joining hands together against this planetary crisis. There's a fundamental problem in that approach. And that is why we are seeing this repeated breakdown in the approach, in the way that COPs are taking, because we don't have any accountability for what we promise, and we don't have any accountability for our own individual footprints.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end, but I just want to ask one question from all, and then maybe, everyone can come. I don't know if it's possible to even do a quick, short answer to it, but it seems like our economic framework, if we want to change it, it should be centered on equity, on justice, and on sustainability. How can we, if we're going to change our economic framework to suit everyone, therefore, if we're talking about equity, justice, for one country, say as you mentioned, Africa, they need to grow. They need to grow far more to reach the development stage of other countries. But in advanced countries where we have already, reached beyond what we need, we can slow down our growth a little bit to allow some carbon capture for other countries to take that advantage. How can we? Is it possible to frame a new economic framework that centers on human rights, on equity, on justice, and takes account of intergenerational, our future, our children and grandchildren, and the living space? Does anybody want to? Yes, please. Yes.
Well, I think that this is a question, asked to all of us. And I try to refer to these problems in my opening remarks, actually, because it is not true that questions of income and wealth inequality are not being discussed. I think that right now we have a very lively discussion on this question. There is clearly an absence of empathy in global politics. If that's a crisis, I don't know, but clearly absence of empathy is there, and the debate hasn't really become sufficiently complete or sufficiently seriously taken. Now, but the debate is there, and there are specific proposals there, and I have referred to the question such as tax fairness, taxes on minimum tax rate for large businesses, questions of debt relief. I mean, an old debate, which of course has become very, very important, or even more important as a result of COVID crisis. So the question of how to prepare financially to build resilience to shocks, all this has to do with obviously taxes, fiscal space, fiscal policies, and international cooperation in these areas. The question is not whether such basic understandings exist. It does exist. But it is not equally appreciated by all, and it's, of course, a polemical discussion, a conflictual discussion that is going on, and it is far from clear what kind of effect it will produce. But proposals are there, and proposals are being discussed, and let's see how far they come and how much can be done in different institutional situations, in G20, for example, in the United Nations, in other places. Of course, there are those who believe that institutional arrangements in this jungle of international relations do not have much future. Well, if that is the case, then the world doesn't have much of a future. But I don't think that this is the case. Sooner or later, issues like this will come more into the center of discussion and possibly also to decisions.
Thank you. Maria, what do you think?
Well, I cannot agree more, and I think sometimes we tend to forget, but we are so conventional economics speak about growth and the need to grow. You said it so well, and countries are measured because in the crisis, in countries are saying, oh, it's this economy is growing only at 1.5. It should be growing, but growth is not an equalizer. Growth is not an equalizer. Redistribution of wealth and power is at the center, and the best way to redistribute power is to redistribute income is through a good, genuine tax deal. At the domestic level first, but also the idea of a global tax architecture that would be able to fill the huge gaps on low carbon financing and adaptation and resilience for developing countries, for example. The number two issue is the issue of debt that Danilo mentioned. That there are many initiatives out there. I co-chair one initiative called Debt Relief for Green Recovery, Green and Inclusive Recovery. And basically the call is to say we need massive debt restructuring for highly indebted countries if we want them to do what they need to do in terms of their climate commitments, mostly on adaptation and resilience building. And the number three issue is that the institutional designs, the governance mechanisms that we have, are designed for a model that is based in a conception of nature as this repository of illimited resources. So we really need to change the metrics, to change the way, to make sure that we internalize the value of nature in the entire supply chains, in the entire value chains that we produce. And I think that Arunava mentioned that very, very clearly. And these are, the mechanisms, the policy, the intellectual mechanisms that we have in hand. But at the end of the day, we've been saying the lack of empathy. I would say, it's the lack of love altogether. And, love as a political category. The only thing that is going to take us out of this crisis is radical love for other humans, radical love for nature, a radical love for the generations to come. Radical love is what is going to transform our societies. And I think it's more than empathy. It's more than that. It's really, conscious generosity. It seems like a soap opera, but it's not. It's perhaps the most difficult issue when you see what is happening as we speak in the Middle East. You see that we talk more about security and less about peace, and we have a problem as humans of exercising radical love as a political category. I would like to end with that.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Ghosh?
I mean, it's hard to beat that. So I would simply say that, we look for the philosophical and the normative reasons, and then we also look for the instrumental reasons. And both are valid in why we need to act together collaboratively in solidarity with each other. And I think it'll be a mix of both strategies. And eventually, that just as, whether you take decolonization, whether you take how technologies of the past spread, including to spread the Green Revolution, whether we look at how we combated, despite our inequalities, the global crisis in the form of the pandemic. I think when humanity is faced with challenges of a certain nature, it takes us a long while to realize that it is a planetary level and a humanity level crisis. Then solidarity becomes both a normative driver and an instrumental driver. It was Victor Hugo who said, no army can stop an idea whose time has come. Maybe that time has come, maybe it is going to come, but the idea is a very powerful one. So let's keep working towards it.
Thank you very much. And let's end this fantastic discussion on the idea of solidarity and love, radical love for all humanity. Thank you all so much for joining us, for giving us your your precious time. I know everyone's come out of conferences, different places, and made an effort to join this conference and share your insights with us all. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Neda. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Danilo.
Thank you.
Bye, Arunava.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.